Welcome to FYI, the For-Your Innovation podcast. This show offers an intellectual discussion on technologically enabled disruption, because investing in innovation starts with understanding it. To learn more, visit arc-invest.com.
ARK Invest is a registered investment advisor focused on investing in disruptive innovation. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. It does not constitute, either explicitly or implicitly, any provision of services or products by ARK. All statements made regarding companies or securities are strictly beliefs and points of view held by ARK or podcast guests, and are not endorsements or recommendations by ARK to buy, sell, or hold any security. Clients of ARK Investment Management may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
From ARK Invest, this is FYI, the For Your Innovation podcast. Today, we're discussing Bitcoin and quantum computing risk. We have a series of experts on the line. We have David Puell from ARK Invest. He's our Bitcoin on-chain analyst. And we have Nic Carter, general partner of Castle Island Ventures. And we're joined also by Alex Pruden, who's the CEO of Project 11. Welcome to the both of you. How are you, Nic?
Oh, great. Yeah, I think the last time I was in your office was 2017. You had a big 3D printed bull, if you remember that. And,
yes, we still possess that bull. It's still very large.
It left quite the impression on me. Yeah.
I mean, within the context of Bitcoin is going to be totally crashed and destroyed by quantum computing, can you possibly be bullish?
Yeah, well, it's kind of, I think you can be. It's in our hands. We control the outcome. So we have agency. We have to use it.
Well, I saw somebody posting about basically our vulnerability to existential risk from AI and saying, to say there's and I think it was Jan LeCun, to say there's a probability of doom ignores the fact that we're in control of that probability to some degree. So, Nic, Alex, I wake up 3.5 years from now and quantum computing has, quote, broken Bitcoin. What does that actually practically and tangibly look like? And is it really right to say that it's broken Bitcoin? What has actually happened?
I mean, a quantum computer breaking Bitcoin implies that it's breaking the cryptography underlying Bitcoin. And one particular aspect of that cryptography, the digital signatures, right? So digital signatures are a cryptographic primitive that are used in Bitcoin to authorize payments, right? So I have a private key. This private key enables me to create a signature, and that signature is attached to a transaction, which lets me send money to you, right? So what a quantum computer effectively does is let me generate your signature without knowledge of your private key. Maybe only if I have knowledge of your public key, which is kind of like your address effectively. I mean, addresses and public keys are slightly different, but for all intents and purposes, someone with a quantum computer without direct knowledge of your private key can generate a signature and thereby authorize a transaction on your behalf. So back to the scenario, 3 years from now, what does this look like? Well, potentially, it looks like someone's funds moving without them having authorized them from moving.
Just to interrupt, I happen to know that my public keys are actually not public. So what do I care?
Yeah, great. So first off, it depends on, if you ever transact, your public key is exposed in the course of that transaction. Because in order for the network to verify the signature, they need the actual public key, not just the address. So if the quantum computer is fast enough, they could potentially create a new transaction and, signing a message saying they're you, and then front run you with a bigger fee and then transfer your money from you to them. So now that, of course, assumes some level of capability from a quantum computer that may not be there in 3.5 years. But there remains this question of what do you do with people who, unlike you, have exposed public keys, which is not, it's a non-trivial percentage of the network. It's actually about a third of the entire network. Not just, classically, there's always the people reference the Satoshi coins, but, many major exchanges, bridges, lending platforms, a lot of on-chain infrastructure, just practically speaking, cannot, avoid reusing the same address and therefore exposing the public key.
Wait, Nic, is that right? Are there public keys that will always have to be perpetually public, or it's just basically people need to move over to best practice, aside from Satoshi, who's probably dead, and so his coins are stuck?
Well, some number of keys will be exposed perpetually unless we do something about it. I think it's about 2.5 million, actually, unless, Satoshi wakes from the dead and we don't know what happened to them. But unless, in the unlikely case, they return and they proactively rotate their keys into whatever post-quantum scheme we have, yes, there will be exposure. Additionally, a lot of practices in the crypto space, less so in Bitcoin, but still in Bitcoin, do presuppose the continual exposure of public keys. So something significant will have to change. Basically, we'll have to have a post-quantum scheme.
And let me just give tangible examples. The Lightning Network uses public keys directly. There are no addresses. It is like a Lightning node advertises its public key. So the extent that this public key is also used on the Bitcoin network, then those funds are directly exposed. And Lightning has no way to avoid that today. The other example would be like a bridge. If I want a bridge between, let's say, Ethereum and Bitcoin, or Bitcoin and something else, that is effectively, usually is implemented as a multi-sig, and that is a static, effectively, it's a static multi-sig. So you're not rotating the signers every single time a transaction happens, right? I mean, you could theoretically do it. The reason why it's challenging, though, is what if I, as a user, save the address of the multi-sig and I keep sending to it multiple times? Well, the only way I can access those funds as the bridge operator is to reuse the key to send them out of there, right? And so this is why, if you look at, we maintain a list of all the exposed public keys. This is exactly why you see many major exchanges that you would think would know better, but practically speaking, they just cannot really avoid exposing some public keys in practice.
Got it. And let me just back up a step. So there's two potential vectors of attack here, right? There's one, there are public keys out there that are, as you're describing, are widely known. The Satoshi addresses are an example that probably will never change. And maybe there are implementations they could change on kind of some of these second layer type actions that protect it, but maybe not. And a quantum computing system that, even if it takes a month of computation to crack the cryptography, could come in and basically be like, I want those coins sent to my address, and send them off. And that's separate from the idea that in every transaction, if I want to transfer Bitcoin, I expose my public key so that I can sign a transaction, and it sits openly available until the transaction gets appended to in a block. And so that's like a separate vector of attack that will happen once a quantum computing is not only powerful enough to crack the cryptography, but to do so in kind of like a less than 10-minute time band. Right. And so those are almost two separate, like the latter is much, much, much more, I would say, dire and serious than the former. And I'd also posit, and tell me if you agree or disagree with this, there's probably going to be some time horizon between the former happening and the latter occurring. And it could be, it could be a decade from one to the other, right?
Well, we certainly hope that's true. I think this is kind of, there's many aspects of this problem that are uncertain. And I think one of them is, what will the capability of the initial quantum computer be, and what will the capability be of like the next generation, and how long will it take to go from this slow clock regime to this fast clock regime? But let me actually say one more thing, because it's actually slightly worse on the fast clock side if you think about it. And this is something that's not immediately obvious to people, which is that once you are in this fast clock regime where you can target transactions in the mempool, it effectively closes off any possibility of migrating on chain to new post-quantum cryptography at that point. Because what would a migration look like? I have a UTXO that is secured by a classical cryptography. I need to I need to make a transaction to send to a new UTXO that is post-quantum secure. So it is a transaction, right? That is the way you would affect this migration. So at the point at which a quantum computer advances far enough that it is fast clock and able to attack transactions in the mempool, effectively you no longer have an on-chain path to migrating. So really, that's like at the very end of any possible window where you could mitigate this quantum risk on chain. So that's why, even in a world where the slow clock attacks, kind of these early attacks targeting these static addresses, are the only thing to worry about, quote unquote, it doesn't remove any urgency whatsoever, I think, to address this problem for everyone.
But imagine I have a quantum computing. Imagine David Puell over here has actually, in fact, a secret announcement. We've been working on a quantum computing at ARC. David has it. It's ready to go. But we're going to have to run it for 1.5 years to get to the underlying addresses. So we've started doing it, right? And so 1.5 years from now, you can expect that we will extract all of the Satoshi coins. And as soon as we cross the threshold where we could do it in any reasonable amount of time, we would begin to do it. So then, and it's not like it's going to jump from 1.5 to 10 minutes, right? It would go 1.5 years, and then we're working on the engineering side and improving it over time. And so wouldn't we see on chain like, hey, this thing is coming, and yes, there's a catastrophic risk down the road, but also imagine we had that quantum computing and we could get to the 10-minute window. That would collapse the value of Bitcoin if we actually, went after that exploit. So then we would be incentivized not to actually go after the mempool. We would just want like our basically bonus for getting there of extracting the Satoshi coins, and then be like, okay, everybody panic and solve this thing. Isn't that like the actual way in which this stuff would occur if we didn't act?
Well, you wouldn't know. No one except for you would know that you're working on cracking one of these addresses, right? So also,
but once I take it, someone would surely know. Somebody would say, hey, I recognize.
We also might not know because you could just go for Binance's cold wallet and represent that it was a hack, conventional hack. So no one with a quantum computer is incentivized to broadcast to the world they have one, because it's kind of like the atomic bomb, right? You don't want to tell anyone you have one until you're really ready to use it. Even after you have one, you could still represent that you did not have one and just go around cracking wallets that could plausibly have been hacked through conventional methods. I mean, we're guessing at who then the motives of, the possessor of the QC.
Yes, I guess though, under the conditions that the possessor of the quantum computer would want to extract the most value out of the network, I would think their incentive would not be to collapse the price of Bitcoin, which going after the mempool would do, right?
I mean, it gets into a whole nother situation. Some people just like to see the world burn, right? Or others.
Yeah. Like the Joker burning piles of money. It's,
And also, there's a nuance here that Alex and Nic, correct me if I got wrong. Basically, there seems to be, as of now, a bifurcation path between the type of qubit, which is very relevant depending if you're dealing with fast clock or slow clock attacks. The bifurcation is on the fast side, superconducting and perhaps photonics. And on the other side, the slow clock would be neutral atoms, which is apparently a very new and scalable tech coming online in the last few years. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about that bifurcation and why not necessarily you will see one first and have years apart between mempool attacks and dormant coin attacks.
Yeah, so I can touch on that. I think you framed it very well. I get maybe I'll just put another framing on it, which is there's generations of quantum computers. So quantum computing has been around as an idea for decades, and quantum computers have actually been built at very small scales. And the first people to build them use these so-called superconducting qubits, which effectively run quickly. They have fast clock speeds, but are very delicate. So it's hard to make quantum computers of any scale, right? So this is the IBM's and the Google's traditional approach. That's sort of what I consider Gen 1. Gen 1, quote unquote, has made tremendous progress. In fact, 2024 Willow was basically Google's demonstration that you can actually do error correction effectively with these systems. So it doesn't mean that there is no path for them to scale. It just means it's hard. But the difficulty of scaling inspired what I consider Gen 2, which, as you mentioned, are neutral atoms. And there's also another approach called trapped ions. And these have the kind of feature that the qubits themselves are much more stable. But the trade-off is they run at a lower clock speed. Now, the so-called, my so-called Gen 3, and by the way, the neutral atom and the trapped ion technology has been sufficiently demonstrated, and you have working quantum computers of that ilk today, right? So Quera, Inflection, these are neutral atom machines. You have Quantinuum and IonQ with ion machines. So these have also demonstrated error correction, and they also run today. The quote-unquote Gen 3 machines are basically attempts to leapfrog, into the future and have something that is both high speed or fast clock and very scalable, right? And so that you mentioned photonics. I think the other one worth mentioning is there's this modality called silicon spins, which basically uses the spin of an electron for a silicon atom to encode a qubit. Why is that important? Well, because silicon is what we make all our semiconductors out of today. And so theoretically, you could go from a 0 to a million qubit chip like that. And so that's potentially very disruptive. But in the world, the way the world is looking now, and if we look at the recent papers and, kind of roadmaps and the progress along those, it feels like the quickest progress is being made by the neutral atom kind of slow clock regime. And so my prediction is we can expect that to probably cross the threshold of cryptographic relevance first. Now, there's a very important nuance here with regards to like how long do we have before everyone's Bitcoin is at risk. And look, one thing about Shor's algorithm is that it is incredibly scalable. Shor's algorithm being the algorithm that you run to make public key cryptography. So that means like even a marginally fewer qubits can get you a huge boost potentially in runtime, even for a slow clock neutral atom machine, right? And so potentially, even though like the qubits themselves are running on like a millisecond cycle, if you have enough of them, you can parallelize the problem and still get to a fast clock regime. Again, but there's a lot of question here on like how hard will it be to scale? How easy is it to parallelize? And will it just end up being that we have some better, newer technology that does this? There's a lot of open questions and unknown unknowns.
I think I take issue with the idea that there's Gen 1 and Gen 2 and Gen 3, which implies that it's like, oh, there's this one architecture we were doing, and then here's this new one that we've discovered that is obviously better and will scale well, as opposed to there being multiple attempts to engineering scale this, none of which we know for sure are going to work. And the evidence against them working is that in some of the areas we've been pushing, it's proven extraordinarily challenging to scale it with, the potential and polluted heavily by the degree to which the companies that are promoting these technologies are incredibly capital consumptive and don't have any immediate term commercial applications that can pay back that capital. So they have to present themselves as, we're going to cross this threshold that's this amazing manna from heaven. We can steal all the Satoshi coins and also do quantum simulation of molecular biology and all this stuff. So they have to like basically present themselves as being just on the cusp of that, enough to attract investor capital to continue to fund these cash burning operations, which then makes the at least in my perception of looking at a lot of technologies, the BS to reality ratio in quantum computing in particular to be very, very high. And so then it causes me as an investor to approach all of this stuff with a higher degree of skepticism than I otherwise do, because there's this dynamic of, we've signed these partnerships with these people where they're really commercially using it. And you like unpick one of the partnerships and you're like, okay, so this is basically a press release with nothing behind it. And so that's like a kind of overarching kind of, I would say, caution to the claims of the, call it the industry writ large, not to say like that there are individual actors that are not appropriately qualifying kind of like their strengths and weaknesses. And I say that with the humility that, yes, it's like neutral atoms, which, 2 years ago, in fact, probably a year ago, I hadn't even like at least deeply looked at all. There is a reasonable case to be made that that's going to scale better. And Google just announced they're kind of investing in that technology for a reason, I think. So it's not to say that it won't be cracked at some point, just that there's like kind of a lot of like investigative operations happening with like a heavy layer of hype on top of it.
That's totally right. I think the one thing that makes this really hard is it's kind of all or nothing. Before you get error correction in whatever modality working in a sufficiently robust way, you kind of can't do anything at all with a quantum computer. So, but once you do get it working in a robust way, you can kind of do a lot of things. And there's like, that's what makes this quite tricky. And kind of the way this comes up in like the discourse with Bitcoin, especially as people are like, well, you can't factor 21 with a quantum computer, allegedly, right? And, physicists have known this, like the approaches to factoring using noisy intermediate scale quantum computers is not really scalable. So there's no point to try and factor 32, even if you could maybe do it. The point is to get the systems down to the level of reliability or up to the level of reliability that you need to factor any number, right? And this is why it's very hard to predict because, again, given how the efficiency of Shor's algorithm, and in fact, the recent Google paper mentioned this, they said, hey, it's wrong to look at potentially factoring of these intermediate kind of size group elements. Once you hit a 2 to the 32, which is roughly 4 billion size number, all cryptography is basically toast at that point, all asymmetric cryptography. So that's like one thing that makes predicting this, I think, quite a hard problem. But I agree with everything that you said. I mean, look, to be clear, there's enormous challenges. Hype has been rampant, like it is in many areas of advanced technology. But also I think in this case, like, it's right to be cautious and it's right to prepare, because the potential that someone does make a breakthrough has enormous and potentially existential implications.
Yeah, Nick, anything you want to add before?
Well, I'll just say I don't want to wager the future of $1 trillion network on this hope that technology does not advance. So
Nick, when did you begin to? I mean, I'm kind of aware that you've been talking about this, call it within the last year, but when did this become something that you started to focus on?
Yeah, it was always like one of those like very long-term things that I wondered about with Bitcoin, but it wasn't something that I at all thought was a real threat. Frankly, I think it was when I met Alex in 2014, and actually a couple other startups working in the sector, that I started to look closer at the projections and also just the track record of what had been achieved in 2024 and 2025. So that some real things did change. And you can see, as you look at these charts of fidelity and qubit count, like it just continues to expand. And for sure, we're a few orders of magnitude away in both of those dimensions. But orders of magnitude can fall fast. Like we saw this with AI, right? It does happen.
I mean, I don't know, because I've looked, like, if you think about, at least on the superconducting pathway, it's kind of like, or at least in the work we've done, Google specifically needs to be doubling physical qubits every year, starting with this year and every subsequent year forward, in order to put Shor in bounds within the mid 2030s and call it running the compute for like a 1 week time window to crack it. And also, Alex, I don't know, like I would take issue with, there is a meaningful delta between like doing it in a week versus doing it in an hour is, I think, on that same trajectory is the difference between mid 2030s to like 2040. So I think that there is a meaningful delta between time on a slow clock versus time on a fast clock on the same technology tree. And also, if you look at even, it's not just hype cycle, as in, like, it's not just companies that are trying to publicly raise from investors, but also, the internal teams at IBM and Honeywell. I think because they've had to argue for their own internal R&D resources, they've laid out timelines of this is when we're going to do this set of things. And those timelines, like, a broad characterization is sometimes they hit the timeline, but it leads them into a local kind of maximum that they have to back off from. So like IBM got to 1,000 something qubits, but now they've scaled back to 100 something physical qubits. And my read is they're just like pushing the complication into figuring out how to like transfer between these modularized chips. And so it's like putting off like another engineering constraint that they're hitting. And I think that there is, and Alex, I think you've put it this way, it's kind of demonstrating that you can error correct qubits, which basically means, hey, I can add more qubits to the system and it doesn't increase my error rate. It means it actually can create more logical qubits over time at some rate. That's one breakthrough that definitively has happened and that we weren't sure was possible. So that's true. But then demonstrating that you can go from this number and continue to scale up the number of qubits and keep them coherent and operating and stuff is at least by the evidence, an extraordinarily hard problem. And I just don't know that I've seen, in maybe neutral atoms, there is evidence of this, that evidence that you can really scale it robustly without running into all kinds of engineering constraints along the way.
I've seen in a few papers or like some research I've done on the side that some of the error corrections for, let's say, photonics and even maybe neutral atoms are like kind of maxing out to the 99.99% level. Alex, I don't know if you have like some sense of that, and they're just waiting to another unit to actually go into max. Is that the case, or are we still like in the order of magnitude away gap.
I guess if I understand your question, is like are the approaches that have been demonstrated for error correction kind of maxed out, or is there more juice to squeeze out of the existing techniques? I think photonics is, generally speaking, the photonic-based quantum computers are, I think, more speculative anyway, because there's a lot of parts of those systems that haven't been demonstrated yet. So I don't even think, I think the error correction is just one of many things that we don't know what the true capability is. On the neutral atom side, I think one of the reasons, so speaking of error correction and slightly more specificity, one of the reasons why people are very excited about neutral atoms, and in fact, the underlying reason why Oratomic in its recent paper was able to advertise Shor's algorithm may be able to be broken in as few as 10,000 qubits, is because of these newer error correcting codes, which effectively enable you to get more logical qubits out of the same number of physical qubits, right? And so these are commonly called QLDPC codes. The reason why neutral atoms are potentially good for those is neutral atom machines it's just easier to connect qubits together, right? These superconducting computers, if anyone has seen a picture of them, they're like these chandeliers, right? And the chandelier actually has nothing to do with the qubit. It's just the dilution refrigerator that you need to get the qubit cooled to superconducting levels, right? And you can imagine plugging a bunch of those together or connecting them would be difficult. And so neutral atoms don't quite have that same architectural constraint. So you can have what is called all-to-all connectivity, which enables you to use these higher rate codes. Now, the trade-off there is that now more emphasis gets put on kind of the classical decoding stack. So you kind of you're able to theoretically have more efficient creation of logical qubits, but it kind of implies that you're able to have a much higher performance decoder. And so to be clear, that is where the engineering bottleneck has shifted, right? And I think, Brett made a great point that and I think it's an important point that there are huge engineering challenges in front of all of these modalities. And I don't think I think it's wrong to pretend otherwise. And even just a milestone that I think is even before scaling logical qubits, I think there's a milestone that no one has demonstrated is the continuous operation of one logical qubit. We've created logical qubits. One has never been continuously operated for any length of time. Of course, the question is, how quickly can you run up that tree, right? Because there's a world in which the doubling isn't even right? If you can theoretically continuously operate one logical qubit, you can maybe just do that 1,000 times and you're at 1,000. So it's unclear. Just this is where I think, you have to just acknowledge there's uncertainty. We just don't know how quickly we're going to progress. But to be clear, the engineering challenges are immense.
Yeah. So, and then there's kind of call it the interested parties saying, hey, we can do this in the next 5 years. Then there's kind of, I honestly think this is a 2045 event, but with huge error bars, right? Within that context, kind of Nic, you and Alex are both advocating for, we need to begin preparing for this now, which seems reasonable given how much uncertainty there is. Why aren't we preparing for it? Or are we preparing for it? You're just unsatisfied with the pace at which the preparations are occurring.
Well, I mean, the underlying reality we have to remember is that, yes, it might be a decade out, it might be 2 decades out, but we're also dealing with a network that has tremendous inertia and changes very slowly, in which we've had 2 meaningful changes to the network in the last decade that were not very controversial. And so any change to Bitcoin that tackles quantum is going to be enormously controversial, especially the matter of the Satoshi coins. So we might as well start arguing about it now, because maybe it is going to take 15 years of arguing. Or maybe we'll argue forever,
But help me get outside of I want to leave aside the Satoshi coins for a second, because David's running our quantum computer and we're going to steal them anyway, and that'll be not going to need to worry about it. But even on the potential upgrade paths for the core way in which the network works, which you could make it more quantum secure conceptually, why not do it now? What are the arguments against moving, with some haste at upgrading it? What trade-offs are having to be made to make it more quantum secure?
Yeah, I mean, it depends who you are actually as a stakeholder. Your stance depends on what part of the network you occupy. So as an investor, you might want to not acknowledge it because you don't want to spook other investors. But as a developer, there's a lot of different concerns. One is that we're seriously talking about a performance degradation when it comes to the signature size and potentially times. and just compute requirements. And, we're talking about moving to a new regime of what's being called cryptographic agility, where you don't, mortgage your network to one signature scheme forever. Even Satoshi acknowledged this, that these cryptographic functions can be broken. We all know it happens progressively. You kind of get a band. You get a couple decades, maybe at best, when a cryptographic function is totally unquestioned, unbreakable. And eventually these things get broken classically, right? Not even quantumly, right? So we have to probably move into a regime of cryptographic agility where maybe we're juggling two different cryptographic functions at the same time. Maybe it's three. The problem is, of course, we don't really have an acknowledged function that we we collectively, the Bitcoiners, think is the path forward. There's many different types. They have different trade-offs. Some of them introduce new cryptographic assumptions, which the developers don't trust, right? So the developers don't trust lattice-based cryptography, even though it's actually been around for a long time. I think they probably should trust it. But, then you have hash-based signatures, which we kind of trust hashes in general, and those are quantum secure. Those are much larger. There are tricks you can do to make them smaller, but that introduces enormous amounts of complexity around the actual wallet infrastructure and custody mechanics. So the big reticence to tackle it is partly, developer incentives. There's no guy that's in charge, so it's very hard to coordinate things. People tend to work on one specific thing in Bitcoin. No one's really put up their hand yet and said, I'm going to be the quantum guy. You just have, you have a whole bunch of dudes and some girls that are working on one tiny little optimization of Bitcoin. Nobody's taking a global, approach. So we have a coordination issue. And we kind of want to work on the signatures for a while until there's one that we're happy to bet on, because you want to keep optimizing it, keep compressing the size. And the optimizations are happening in real time. Every week, it seems, there's a new signature scheme that comes out. So there's a lot of reticence to hop immediately to one of the ones that NIST has standardized.
Well, couldn't we, just to think about the way this could develop. One, just so I understand, if you have a much larger, essentially, signature size within a block, that just restricts the number of transactions that could push through the block. Is that the right way to think about the performance degradation?
Yeah, but we're talking about with Sphinx, for instance, you're moving from sub 100 bytes to several kilobytes or even tens of kilobytes. So it's a massive performance degradation.
I think that the trade-off is from 7 transactions per second, it can go as low as 0.3 transactions per second. And with shrinks, that goes from 7 to 4 transactions per second.
And shrinks introduces a lot of additional problems for any custodian, basically.
Okay. Well, so imagine that I have behind David's quantum computer, which we're running for the next year and a half. Behind that, I have some very advanced AI models that are actually improving every day. And conceptually, I can use those AI models to come up with a very efficient cryptographic scheme. And the cryptographic scheme that I can come up with will be much better a year from now than it is today because of the power, basically the mathematical, logical power of these underlying AI models. Shouldn't I then at least delay for a few years until we figured out what the most efficient cryptographic scheme is, and then push that to the network?
Well, that's what the developers are asking for. And I don't think they're using AI, but basically mathematicians test hypotheses and try and find ways to break the schemes and propose new. And post-quantum schemes have been broken classically. So this isn't a theoretical thing. This is a real thing. If we pick the wrong scheme and wager Bitcoin's future on that scheme, and then it's breakable classically, we've just shot ourselves in the foot. So yeah, the developers basically want to wait, but at a certain point, you kind of have to just bite the bullet and pick one.
Yeah, I think maybe the comment I would make here is that it doesn't have to be an either or, right? I think something Nic said earlier was around this concept of crypto agility. I think Bitcoin and other digital asset networks should potentially consider doing both things, waiting and developing better, more performance signatures, but not waiting to implement what we think will be post-quantum secure today and being conservative. Because I think there's like sort of a philosophical question at root here, like why do we trust any cryptography? And, without delving into complexity theory, et cetera, I think that what it comes down to is things that have been around longer are more trustworthy. So I like the logic to me that some new thing is going to come out next year and then everyone is going to be like, oh, this is more secure than something that's been around for 20 years. I don't think holds. It might be more performant, but it's not clear people will view it as more secure. And I think the performance trade-offs have to be much, much, much better for people to realistically consider. I mean, Bitcoin has historically been very conservative with all of its cryptography choices along exactly this dimension. Throughout blockchains, there's a lot of pretty novel cryptography that gets deployed from zero knowledge proofs to advanced hash functions. Bitcoin does none of that. It's all very, very old school, time tested stuff. And so to me, the idea that some new thing would come around the corner and solve all the problems isn't realistic. That doesn't mean, though, if it does, that Bitcoin shouldn't adopt it. But I don't think that Bitcoin should wait either in taking the performance hit potentially for the short term in order to guarantee security for the network for the long term.
Is there a world where we can have hash and lattice-based schemes at the same time? And what's the hesitancy against lattice here?
Well, there's definitely a world where you could have two different UTXO types that are authorized one via lattices and one via hash-based signatures. It adds complexity, right, to the logic, to the nodes, right? Nodes now have to be able to verify two new different authentication paths, which increases the surface area potentially to screw things up. So that would be the counter argument against it. But the argument for it would be exactly this. Is like, okay, well, we have one that's maybe the smaller size signatures and faster signing. And we have one that's like really more conservative and it's bigger, but like maybe we only use that for big, big transactions. Look, in my opinion, that's going to be the direction that everything goes in blockchain, just simply because we're leaving this golden age where ECDSA and classical cryptography that we had for the last few decades is just the one thing that works for every use case or every trade-off set. I think because of the performance characteristics of these post-quantum schemes, there is no longer one size fits all. One thing that's Nic kind of referenced, but I'll make explicit is, for a lot of these hash-based signature schemes, they lack any kind of algebraic structure to do something fancy like a multi-party computation type of wallet. So any custodian workflow that works today for ECDSA is not guaranteed to work at all in a world of hash-based signatures and even potentially lattice-based, right? And so that means I think there's going to necessarily be a period of exploration as people rebuild some of these primitives that are critical for security and UX. We don't have the benefit of potentially a long time before we know a quantum computer will be there. It may take a while for a quantum computer to show up, but it may not take a while. And so it's better to be safe than sorry and have something even suboptimal.
Shouldn't something like, and maybe this has already occurred, but something like Litecoin in attempt to market differentiate, because quantum fear, uncertainty, and doubt is apparently what's causing Bitcoin to not trade as well, though I'm a little skeptical of that, but let's just pretend that. And so then we have somebody else push into the pool with new cryptography, creating a honeypot where if it's actually classically crackable, then their network gets blown up. And once we've seen them kind of jump in the pool and flounder around for a while, it's like, okay, that seems to work. And then use that as like the testing grounds.
Yeah, every Bitcoin will be the last L1 to upgrade. So this is what's going to happen. So, Ethereum's got their plan by 2029. Ripple announced something yesterday. They will all do it. And Bitcoin will be the last one.
It's not immediately clear, though, that it necessarily lets you speed run if you even do it, right? Let's just say that Litecoin took lattices and they ran with it. There just may be a philosophical aversion to newfangled cryptography like lattices from the Bitcoin community. So I think there's there's two things that are being assumed there.
Yes, but if there's a flaw in this, I'd rather have, some billions of dollars rather than trillions of dollars extractable via that flaw. So I can say, hey, well, it survived like some amount of time with $1 billion in play. And then therefore I'm willing to put $1 trillion in play.
Yeah, potentially. But if you were a smart attacker, you'd wait for the $1 trillion to be in play. Again, though, it's hard to say. Would someone just take the $1 billion? Maybe they would. It's hard to know. I think it's still, to me, I guess, to the point of like, why is Bitcoin held off and what should they do? I think there's no reason, in my view, to hold off making their own independent effort, even if ultimately they can draw, like the Bitcoin community can draw inspiration from and confidence from other efforts elsewhere.
Okay, so let's say there's going to be some development pathway. No matter what happens, we're going to have these coins that are just like sitting there vulnerable, being like, take me to whoever develops the quantum computer, owned by ostensibly Satoshi. What should we do about those? Is that a threat to the network that no matter what kind of upgrade should the upgrade also protect those coins, or should it be just designed to be like people who are savvy enough to transfer over to the new scheme should be protected and those should be like left out as a honeypot?
Well, this is the big debate. And, I think we can actually just safely assume Bitcoin will upgrade. I know that's like a kind of crazy thing to say because we haven't really seen any signs of that happening, but I'm just going to assume there will be a PQ signature scheme added to Bitcoin. You'll be able to migrate at your pleasure over the next decade. Great. Everyone that's alive that controls their coins will migrate. There will probably around 2.5 million is my guess. This actually comes from Jameson Lopp. That's his guess.
So it's to interrupt there, Nick. So you have 1.1 Satoshi coins and then 600,000 of never spent coins. How do you go from that into 2.5 million?
That's kind of the more expanded scope set of coins that are presumed abandoned. And more than just the P2PK, the 1.7 P2PK outputs.
Got it.
Yeah,
so
it's like moved once and then never moved again and probably lost on a hard drive, that kind of stuff.
There's the matter of those coins. But this is actually the more challenging problem, much more so than I think the question of what signature to use and how we're going to upgrade technically. Because now we're talking about a choice between 10% unexpected dilution and violating the property rights of the network. So we're forced into like a very hard choice.
But that's not that hard a choice. Why not just the coins are out there. Just let the coins get taken if they're going to get taken. Why is that? This seems like an obvious choice to me.
And well, because people have very strong feelings on both sides. People have so first of all, I think most of those coins were actually never really part of the network in a true sense. Like I think what actually happened was Satoshi burned the coins as they mined them. So they're never really part of Bitcoin. And over time, the market has come to understand Bitcoin is this thing with roughly 2 million immobilized coins. So for all intents and purposes, the coins are new. But the real problem is not just 10% inflation, whatever. It's that there's some unknown, potentially malicious entity that will, not through genuine economic activity, but more through subterfuge, come to control those coins. And I think that's the problem. Is that we don't know who they are, what their motives are, what they want, and it could literally be anyone.
Isn't that great economic utility of the Bitcoin network that there's this 10% of supply honeypot sitting out there for whoever drives quantum computing forward far enough to be able to extract it? And you would say, that's not a malicious actor. That's someone who's like very technically and engineering savvy.
Yeah, and I think that's the way it could go. Actually, I think it's the just reward for a quantum attacker. That's what Bitcoin ended up being for, the teleology of Bitcoin, right? But, and I think it's actually just a matter of arranging that transition in a way that is stable for Bitcoin, that doesn't destroy it. So I think there's a case for the government.
But what do you mean by destroy it? I mean, I increase supply by 10. It's kind of like, imagine the reason, if Bitcoin had 23 million instead of 21 million as the ultimate supply, it wouldn't be a meaningfully different thing. Now, if suddenly it went from there's 21 million in supply to we're arbitrarily going to increase it to 23 million, I think that would be much more dangerous to the network. Here you have, you're right that these were never a part of the network and that they've never been moved. They're never in circulation. Some people have maybe a reasonable expectation that they never would be. And, it's possible Satoshi's out there somewhere and he's like, I'm going to spend it all on, I don't know, buying a country or something, but I think it's a much better assurance of the network to be like, no, these are the rules and we're updating the protocols, but we're not going to do some like special class action. We're protecting these coins because they're somehow virginal and sanctified, right?
Well, I think maybe one thing I call back to an earlier part of the conversation, we talked about potentially what a quantum adversary would do if they were economically rational. I think leaving aside the philosophy that motivated the creation of Bitcoin, property rights, and this is why it's a hard issue, but if you were purely economically rational, I think there's no question what you would do. You would advocate for these coins to be burned because potentially and by the way, it's not an entirely just economically selfish thing to think. I mean, if people, as people do, they compare Bitcoin to digital gold, right? And theoretically, this comparison to digital gold gets broken if there is some attack, or not an attack, but someone profiteering off 10% of the network all at once, and it drops the price so much and it creates a bunch of volatility. It makes it seem like a less safe asset because we know we compare it to digital gold, but to be clear, gold has had millions of years of history of value, right? And maybe we're afraid that the integrity or this comparison that we're making that is ultimately the core of the value proposition gets damaged. And so maybe for that reason, you would justify an intervention to prevent a disruption at that scale to encourage people to continue to store their wealth here. That would be the argument. I'm not saying I agree with it, but that would be the argument.
I was just going to say, you put some numbers to this problem in dollars. How much, 2.5 million Bitcoins, how much is that in dollars? It's like, whatever, 150, $200 billion. So DPRK gets that, let's say. They could do anything with that money. Like, that is unjustly earned, cash. So they could destroy Bitcoin with that. They could sell the coins, or they could bribe the miners.
You could not legitimately say, if you gave me 10% of the supply and my mission was to destroy Bitcoin, I could not destroy Bitcoin. I disagree with that contention. Two, if North Korea is able to develop a quantum computer before anybody else, all of my philosophy of the way the world works is totally broken. It would totally break my brain if that were the first actor to have a working quantum computer. I cannot even imagine the universe in which that occurs. So let's set that aside. Now, China is a sovereign state. Imagine China as a sovereign state is doing all kinds of things to develop kind of quantum computing. My suspicion is they'd have bigger fish to fry than the Bitcoin network. They, maybe they extract the Satoshi coins, but they'd rather conceal their cards and be, sucking up all the, cryptographic information that's passing across everything on a spying basis rather than messing with Bitcoin. But I mean, I still think it's whoever gets there first, this is just rewards.
Well, they can run the quantum computers at night when they're not doing, when they're not spying on us in their off time. Yeah, it's a free $100 billion. You might as well do it.
Korea could actually form a co-expertise coalition, the quantum from the China side.
China and North Korea work together, right? Where does North Korea go when they steal Ethereum? The Ethereum they stole 2 days ago, where are they going to? They're going to sell that to on Chinese OTC markets. So
yes. Well, I think that it's valid that stolen cryptocurrencies generally are definitely funding nefarious activity. And so you could advocate, well, if this is basically an easy couple $100 billion to plug into nefarious activity, we should stop it. But isn't that, again, imposing a moral judgment on the network that just seems like it's a dangerous and slippery slope to go down? And you're better off just writing it off, just being if Satoshi had really wanted these to be ungrabbable, if there was cryptographic advance, he could have done. Couldn't he have burned them to a non-public address or something, or done something to really, really, truly burn them out of the network?
Yeah, Satoshi had a lack of foresight here, unfortunately. Satoshi is not perfect, and this was their one big mistake.
But no, or he thought, one, if these are still around and I'm not around to move them, then they should be up for whoever can grab them.
Satoshi was aware of quantum, interestingly. So this was foreseeable completely. But for whatever reason, Satoshi chose it to be that way.
I think also, if you see the late Satoshi movie, you get a sense of why that specifically might not have been a top of mind before Satoshi disappeared.
Yeah, and I think this is actually why the identity of Satoshi really matters. I know it's very uncouth to talk about that, but I think it's actually worth putting some resources into figuring out who it was so we can figure out what their motives were, so we can properly determine what to do with the coins.
Does it matter to the network what his motives were? As in, the whole point of the thing is it's this, clock that was set running. and it continues to run. And kind of there, you don't have to go back and kind of parse the documentation to be like, oh, this is what was intended to happen to these coins. It's he left them in a vulnerable state, and then therefore they are vulnerable. That's just the way it is.
Yeah, maybe that
they.
is the intent. The intent is just what's legible to us. But maybe Satoshi left a note. It's.
No,
I think we should find out.
And it also plays like culture is game theoretical, right? So I know for many hardcore people in the Bitcoin maxi side, let's say, including devs, would for sure open their ears a little bit more to an inference from Satoshi, especially because, Bitcoin has become kind of a culture in that way. So they think it could move needles.
And I would say just kind of more pragmatically, this is dividing the community. Like even the devs. Like last year there was a summit at the Presidio Bitcoin folks hosted, and they surveyed, and this was kind of consisted of a lot of big capital holders and core devs and some other folks that are kind of, I would say, core Bitcoin community members. And this was a question that was basically like, what should you do with the Satoshi coins? Do nothing or burn them? And I think there was a third option, which was recycle them at the end of the supply curve or something. But the audience in that room at the time was split a third. And they published this on X. I think that you can see the results. And so the reality is like people are not all aligned on this. And therefore, I think that implies it's going to take some time to potentially reach a solution that even the majority of people would be aligned with. It's not clear we're there today.
I want to ask that same question to each of you three, and I'm going to ask it once, and then I'm going to offer a precondition to it and ask it. So, Alex, would you burn them or leave them vulnerable if you were the dictator of Bitcoin?
Do I get a third choice that I get to define, or do I have to answer for those two?
What's your third choice? But you have to answer between those two. But
my personal preference would be to take them out of circulation and add them to the end of the supply curve, thereby increasing the length of time that miners are incentivized to secure the network. That would probably be what I would personally choose.
Got it. And so you would follow the same diminishing supply schedule, and it would just extend beyond whatever 2130 or whatever that is. Is that the
3141
exactly.
into
exactly?
Whatever.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Nic.
Yeah, if we had to change Bitcoin in some way to accommodate this, I would do the same as Alex is saying. But my first choice is actually we leave them there, and then we just hope that America wins, and then we, in an orderly manner, confiscate the coins for safekeeping. Well, the government does it with Google or whoever. So that would be the best choice. So everyone wins in that case.
Again, the same first choice. And I like kind of like Nic's idea. If the first one fails,
So wait, you would just leave it. You would leave them vulnerable also, as in just leave them out there and hope that America wins.
I would redistribute to the end of the supply curve as well. I think it also solves
Proactively. You wouldn't just like let them sit there.
right. And because I also think it adds another strength to one of Bitcoin's remaining weaknesses, which is like the miners getting paid well into the future.
If I preconditioned the survey based on what is your answer consistent with what you think is in the long-term defined over, call it 20 years value accrual to the Bitcoin network? Or thinking about it from that perspective, would you change your answer?
Well, this is why I like my answer, because the coins do re-enter circulation in a sense, but they just go into like a pot of money that is probably not going to move. And we didn't change anything with the monetary schedule.
Yeah. But to me, that's like maybe not obvious, but yes, I'm on board with that. It's like, listen, quantum computing is a thing. It also if the mempool is going to come under threat, I want there to be a canary in the coal mine that tells me that it's going to come under threat. So have a pool of assets out there that can be quantum cracked so that it, gets to quantum computing safe Bitcoin in the event that it happens earlier than expected. I'm glad we had this talk. I think we solved it for Bitcoin. So let's go ahead and, just leave them vulnerable and no more quantum computing, pure uncertainty and doubt then, I guess.
Yeah, we've resolved it.
Nice work, everybody.
All right.
Okay, well, there's like, we could go in infinite depth on quantum computing, and I encourage you all to follow Nic and Alex on X or wherever you all, that's probably where you all mostly operate, right? In terms of information provision. All right. And thanks for joining. Enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, this is amazing. Thank you.
ARC believes that the information presented is accurate and was obtained from sources that ARC believes to be reliable. However, ARC does not guarantee the accuracy or completeness of any information, and such information may be subject to change without notice from ARC. Historical results are not indications of future results. Certain of the statements contained in this podcast may be statements of future expectations and other forward-looking statements that are based on ARC's current views and assumptions, and involve known and unknown risks and uncertainties that could cause actual results, performance, or events to differ materially from those expressed or implied in such statements.